Hello, happy Friday, everybody. It's Food Safety Fridays. My name is Simon Simpley from the International Food Safety and Quality Network. Today, our good friend from AIB International, Earl Arnold, joins us. And today, the topic is tips on having an FDA inspection. Hot topic, and we've got almost 1,500 people registered, so we're expecting a great webinar. It's nice to have you back, Earl. Good morning. Where are you joining us from today?
Yeah, good morning, Simon, and glad to be here. I'm calling in from Austin, Texas, where we've been seeing over 100-degree Fahrenheit weather for like the last month.
Yeah, we had a speaker on from Trace Analytics, and they're in your neck of the woods, and she was saying, I work in centigrade, they're saying it's over 40 degrees,
right,
which is a bit hot. Anyway, I'm in Manchester. It's nice and cool here, probably about 20 degrees, and it's 3 p.m. Tell us where you're joining from in the sidebar. It's always good to know. Jerry from Indianapolis, Ayesha from South Africa. Wherever you're from, you're very welcome. We're going to play the sponsors ads now, and we're back in 2 minutes for Earl's presentation. Okay, I'll be back for the Q&A later, but for now, I'll hand you over to Earl.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you, Simon, and hello, everyone from around the world. I want to thank you for taking the time to join and go through this presentation and discussion. For today's presentation, we're going to discuss how to remain prepared for an FDA inspection. And I'm sure many of you are all aware of how important regulatory inspections are. We want to discuss and include how you can be prepared and maybe even reduce some of that regulatory anxiety. So let's get started. Now, my name is Earl Arnold, and I am the Food Defense Manager and one of the Quality Managers at AIB International. And I'm just going to share with you some tips and tricks and things to consider in your regulatory policy. Now, if you are not familiar with AIB International, for over 100 years, we have been committed to promoting the integrity of the supply chain by raising food safety and quality standards around the world. Our training, certification, inspection, and consulting services help our customers navigate the complexities of the food industry while providing tailored solutions to their needs. Our services are available where our customers need us. Now, our mission is simple: and you can see it on the screen. We work really hard with our customers to promote food integrity, foster continuous education, and navigate the complexities of the food industry. Now, here are the topics that we'd like to discuss today or include in our discussion. First, we want to consider what happens in an FDA regulatory inspection and ensure our policies, procedures, and work instructions include what we want to do to comply with those requirements. This includes understanding all applicable regulatory requirements we need to meet, such as regulated good manufacturing practices, food safety plans like regulated HACCP or the preventative controls for human food or animal food regulations, and even regulated food defense. Now, second, once we understand those requirements, we want to develop policies and procedures and train all involved so they understand their roles and responsibilities. And as a reminder, anyone that has a role with any of these regulatory requirements or responsibilities needs to be considered a qualified individual for that role. Third, we want to verify that all things are in compliance. We want to ensure we conduct physical as well as program reviews to ensure all is working as the programs require. And then last, and I believe it's the most important, we want to be audit ready every day so that if and when regulatory inspectors come in, we're not stressed at all. We know we're good to go. Now, FDA, Food and Drug Administration, assumes that the food industry wants to comply with regulatory requirements, and I agree with that statement. I've had the pleasure of meeting many food safety professionals, and I've never met one person that said, I really don't care what I do. Everyone wants to make sure they're making a safe and good quality product. So FDA assumes that when they're conducting inspections. The intent for them is just to ensure that they reduce the food safety risks by ensuring facilities are compliant to all applicable regulations. Now, FDA has worked really hard to develop guidance documents and information for people to succeed at meeting the requirements. And they try their best to engage and educate and provide technical assistance before and while it regulates these items. Now, FDA has also developed appropriate channels of communication to inform the industry about new regulations or guidance documents and information. They promote their websites with all the information and links. They send out newsletters, and they also join other organizations when they had food safety events as guest speakers to also promote these things. Now, this may be a review, for some of you. However, it really is important for us to discuss this. An FDA regulatory inspection can be conducted by FDA personnel, which are easy to identify because they're going to have identification that supports this, or maybe even a badge. It also, in the United States, could be done by a local state health department personnel, like say, if we're talking about Texas, the Texas Health Department can be contracted by FDA to come in and do an inspection focusing on FDA requirements. And then the third option can be, and most likely outside of the United States, there are accredited, highly trained third-party companies that have been identified and can do FDA audits contracted. Now, these inspections could be done by an individual or it could be done by a team of inspectors. And as a quick side note, you can see on the screen there's a web link. If you would like a little bit more information about the accredited third parties and who can conduct them, because in there's a listing of who's authorized and been trained, you can click that link to get more information. And in addition, in the Food Safety Modernization Act, specifically Section 307, it covers the requirements of accredited third parties and their use. Now, if you are a facility or a company that is required to register with FDA, then more than likely you're subject to an FDA inspection. This includes facilities that are located in the United States and also those that are located outside the United States, and you produce product that's going to be exported and consumed in the United States. Now, if your facility falls under the requirements of USDA, then you would be exempted. However, it's important to understand that there are some facilities that may fall under USDA for part of their facility and processes, but then on the other part, it falls under FDA. So in cases like that, FDA could still come in and do an inspection, but they would only focus on the FDA requirements in that part of the facility. Now, it's important to understand the reasons FDA may want to conduct an inspection. The more common reason is routine inspections. No specific reason outside they want to ensure you are compliant with all applicable regulatory requirements for the products produced at your facility. Or for those of you that are located outside the United States, the focus of the inspection would be just those products that you produce for the United States. Now, FDA has increased frequency of inspections, and that frequency increase is based on the risk of the product. As an example, if you make products specifically for immune compromised individuals, like say you're making it for hospitals, for senior citizens, or maybe even like diabetics specifically for that, well, then FDA may increase the risk or increase the inspections because there is a higher risk of those products affecting that compromised community. But FDA can also conduct inspections for cause, meaning they received a complaint or there's been a noted commodity issue dealing with maybe a recall event. And so if that's the case, FDA could show up and their focus would be specifically for that issue to ensure that it's compliant or to ensure that things are in control. Now, it's important to understand that when FDA does a for-cause inspection or when they're doing a routine and they find an issue, when FDA is looking at something, they're looking at, one, credible evidence. So they're seeing nothing wrong or they're seeing a significant issue. And then they also are utilizing the thought process of reason to believe. And how I explain this is, let's say FDA is doing inspection. They see a potential issue with flaking paint above a product zone. They necessarily do not have to stand there and wait for paint to fall before they can say, guys, we have a significant issue. What they've been doing lately is saying, guys, I think we have a problem, but I need you to prove to me that paint's not in your product. So can you show me that it's not in your product? So we need to understand how FDA inspects and how they look at potential observations. Now, these are also important to understand. These are basics. FDA has the authority to inspect during normal business hours. Now, some people believe, well, that's great. That's 9 to 5. So I'm not worried about anything after 5 p.m. Normal business hours means your operating hours. So if you are a 24-hour, 6-day-a-week facility, then FDA can show up at any time you're producing product to conduct an inspection. Many of you, though, that are located outside the United States, FDA will attempt to set up an appointment. So you have a little bit more leeway in most cases. You should be aware that FDA may take samples during an inspection, either for routine purposes or because of an issue. So you want to include in your policies and procedures what your facility is going to do if and when that happens. Also, FDA may take photos or want to take photos. So included in your policies and procedures should be what your facility's policy is. It does not matter what you do. There's no right or wrong answer on how you apply your processes in your facility, but you want to be prepared and have your people trained on what those requirements are. Now, when an inspector shows up and is doing a inspection on behalf of FDA, In most cases, they should have what you see on the screen is a Form 482. This is a notice of inspection. And so if a accredited third party comes in and says, I'm doing an FDA inspection, they should be able to provide this. However, there's sometimes, just like all of us, we forget something. They might not have brought the document with them. So in your policies and procedures, you should include what will you do if a Form 482 is not presented. Also on the slide, you can see we talk about a Form 483. For some of you that may not know, a Form 483 is what FDA uses to write down observations that may mean you didn't meet regulatory compliance. So you want to make sure that you have included in your policies, if you're given a Form 483, what does your facility personnel do? If requested to sign, will you sign or not sign? And then one more form that's not listed on the screen that you should be aware of is a Form 484. This is a form that's given when FDA takes samples, and so it's a record for your facility that they have them. And so you should include in your policies what you do when you receive it, or for instance, if FDA doesn't provide one, what does your facilities do? Now, FDA does have a right to request records when they're doing an inspection. They can copy the records or they can retain them for their further investigation. So for example, they can ask to review records that are related to manufacturing practices, preventative controls or critical control points, your overall food safety plans, maybe even your supply control programs if you have a supply chain preventative control, even your verification activities. Really, FDA can request all records with the exception of two things. One, trade secrets. So like if you have a secret formula that could compromise your competitive edge, FDA can't ask for those documents. And in most cases, financial documents, with the exception of, in many of the FSMA regulations, there are exceptions or business sizes that may not have to comply with parts of the regulation. We know this as very small businesses, but there's a financial implication for meeting that qualifier. And so in those cases, FDA can ask for financial records to ensure that you're meeting the definition of a very small business. And that financial level is a little bit different between the different regulations. As an example, the preventative controls for human food regulation, to meet the qualifier is $1 million for 3 years in a row. For regulated food defense, that's $10 million for 3 years in a row. So there's differences. Also, it's important to understand that FDA is asserting their rights to take photos. Now, I'm not saying this because if your policy is to say, no, FDA, you can't take photos, but you need to be aware that FDA may pressure hard, and what are you and your personnel going to do? Also, it should be known that FDA is doing their best to go back to basics. So when they're doing these inspections, we're hearing that they're being more comprehensive and they're paying closer attention to sanitation practices. They're really focusing on if you handle allergens in your facility and how you're minimizing the potential of allergen cross contact and or not declaring all the allergens in your products. Many of you may know that that's the #1 reason for recalls from FDA is undeclared allergens. And they're also looking hard at personnel practices. Are personnel following the GMPs and doing the right thing? In short, they're looking at the key sources of the most common failures when they're doing inspections. So here we have our first poll for today. So Simon's going to run the poll. And the question is, what was the #1 reason for facilities being issued a 483, a Form 483 in 2022? And there are your 4 choices. What do you guys think?
Okay, I can see votes are coming in. and we have personnel practices is the favourite, around 40%. Gotta catch it quick. Not having a foreign supplier verification program is required, probably around 30%. And then maybe pest control issues, and then not implementing corrective actions. So is that what you, is the pattern you expected, Earl?
Yes, it actually was. And surprisingly, all four of these options were in the top 5 in 2022. But the number one reason a 483 was issued over 700 times for facilities not having a foreign supplier verification program. Right. So that was the number one reason for getting a 483 in 2022.
Okay. Interesting.
Now, once you have developed your policies to support how you want to handle an FDA inspection, in other words, how you're going to handle when FDA shows up or their partners, who's going to be in charge of the inspection, what are we going to do with recording devices, all of that, then we want to make sure that we ensure that all individuals that have a role or responsibility in that is trained to understand what is required. As an example, what should the person at reception do? So if FDA shows up to a facility, they're going to come in and say, "Hey, I'm here to do a regulatory inspection." What should happen? All of that should be included into your policies and the appropriate people changed. If you have security guards, and that's who FDA is going to come into contact with first, the security guard should be trained on, if FDA shows up, these are the things we want you to do. Who should they contact? Who should they reach out to? You also want to include in your procedures who needs to be present during the opening meeting, during the inspection, the closing meeting. How will the interviews occur? Because FDA will request to interview people. How are you going to share documents? What I've seen as a best practice is many facilities will bring a laptop in the room. They will hook up to a TV monitor in the room, and they will only plug in the monitor when they've got the document ready to share on the screen, so that they're only sharing with FDA the specific document they requested, and FDA can't see them going through their files or showing different documents for then FDA to say, "Excuse me, can I look at that one right there too?" So you want to include all of these things into your program, and then you also want to include who's responsible for what. Now, training is very critical, as I mentioned earlier. There are many regulatory requirements for having specialized trained people. As an example, preventative controls for the human food and animal food regulation requires a preventative controls qualified individual. And there's special training or education or experience that has to be for that person that's going to fulfill that role. Those of you that are required to comply with regulated HACCP, juice, or seafood, you have to have specially trained people that are managing those programs that understand those requirements. And then those of you that may be required to comply with regulated food defense, as an example, this requires a food defense qualified individual that has special training in 4 different areas or experience so that you can manage those programs and meet all the requirements. But all of these regulations also include a requirement for qualified individuals. These would be, as you see the definition, these would be individuals that have just special roles. So like if you have a preventative control, that would be a qualified individual would be the person doing the monitoring event or the person that would verify that monitoring event. And so there's a lot of requirements for trained and qualified individuals that we want to make sure that we meet in our programs. Now, FDA will determine the status of qualified individuals in 3 ways. Through interviews, they will ask questions to determine if the individual understands their specific role and responsibilities. So such as, I see that you monitor a preventative control. Can you tell me what you do? They'll also observe individuals conducting their roles and responsibilities and verify they're following the regulatory requirements as well as what's written in the specific procedure or policy. And they're not going to necessarily say, can you tell me what you do? And then can you show me what you do? They'll go somewhere else and try to observe that person doing the job without trying to interfere or even appear like they're observing them, just to ensure that they're doing the right things. And last, they may verify training was conducted and documented. So they may ask for proof of training, as documenting training is a regulatory requirement to demonstrate proof. Now, since qualified individuals is a regulatory requirement, you want to verify that all of your training you've conducted meets the regulatory requirements. You can explain how the training did include the regulatory requirements. And all training is documented for everyone. You may also want to ensure all qualified individuals can explain their roles and responsibilities. When this occurs, FDA does not expect those individuals to use regulatory language. They want to hear it in their own words. So as a best practice, which you all may want to consider doing, is when you're doing your various reviews of your programs, or maybe even doing self-inspections of your facilities, practice conducting interviews with those individuals so they can practice and understand, but you know they can actually answer those questions. And then here's our second poll question for the presentation. What prerequisite program can assist in being FDA ready? Which one do you think's the best answer?
Okay, the poll's loaded. Wait for some votes to come in. Oh, there we go. Here we go. We'll just give a few seconds for it to settle down. Question, what prerequisite program can assist in being FDA ready? Possible answers, written personnel practice requirements, third-party GFSI audit, self-inspection program, or preventive maintenance program. You can only choose one. So 50% self-inspection, around 30% third-party GFSI audit, 11% written personnel practice requirement, and then 7% preventive maintenance program. So how's that look, Earl?
That looks really good. And in my personal opinion, I agree with what most people are saying. The self-inspection program is probably the number one program that can support meeting the requirements. In a self-inspection program, we're looking at all the physical physical issues of our facility. I don't disagree that third-party audits can assist, but there is a difference between a GFSI audit and what we're required to do there and meeting regulatory requirements. And so they can help, but they may not always focus on what the regulatory requirements are. So really good job, everybody. So the self-inspection program can be leveraged to determine if a facility is ready for an FDA inspection. Many of you may be familiar with this prerequisite program. Now, I've conducted many inspections and audits throughout my career. I've been in the food industry for well over 30 years, and I could not even come up with a number of how many inspections and audits I've done. But I've reviewed facilities, completed self-inspections, and many times you do a great job of identifying gaps, such as identifying issues. However, sometimes we're lacking in documenting corrective actions or verifying the corrective actions were implemented and effective afterwards. Other gaps that I've noted before is this being kind of just like a quick inspection to meet the program requirements, but not really meeting the intent behind the program. Why I mention this is, take a look at your self-inspection programs. Is it really rigorous? Are the people conducting the self-inspections clearly understanding the regulatory requirements as well as the program policies, and are we looking hard to ensure that we're meeting our requirements? Now, also internal audits can assist too as well, corporate or doing our own facility internal audits. This does allow you to do a deep dive into your written programs to be able to ensure, yep, we're following our programs, we're meeting the intent, or here we have some gaps, we need to implement some written corrective actions. They should include reviewing all the supporting documents for the regulatory programs, like the preventative controls for human or animal food, or regulated HACCP. Are we meeting our monitoring requirements for PCs or CCPs? Or if we're required to comply with regulated food defense, are we meeting our requirements for our mitigation strategies? Or if we have supply chain preventative controls, are we meeting our requirements in our approved supplier program, because that would be a regulatory requirement. And then, like I mentioned before, FDA looks really hard at allergen controls. So is our allergen control program really robust? Are we not having any issues and meeting requirements? All of this is important to take a look at when we're also doing our internal audits. Now, when we do identify gaps within either our self-inspections or internal audits, and we're doing our program reviews, documented corrective actions are required. And this is something that I do want to just briefly touch on. As an example, if you're doing your own internal reviews, and let's say you identify a gap, one of the regulatory requirements for the preventative controls for human food rule is, if you have a preventative control and you're monitoring it, once you've completed that document, there's a regulatory requirement to verify that record within 7 working days. Many common things that I see during inspections is facilities may have a couple of gaps. 2 or 3 or 4 preventative controls just weren't verified. But if you, during your own internal reviews, identify that and you implement written corrective actions, and if FDA reviews that a little bit later, that's not going to be a finding, because you, the facility, identified the gap, implemented documented corrective actions, and had fixed the problem. So this is another reason why doing really good self-inspections and internal audits can make you ready for FDA inspections, because you're finding the problems first, correcting it, and making sure that you're reducing the potential of it occurring again. And if necessary, you're including investigation and disposition of your products. Now, one more thing I want to cover is we want to stay up to date what FDA is talking about. And one of the biggest things that FDA has been talking about lately is food safety culture. FDA, everywhere they've had a chance to speak, and on their website, you're going to see this all over the place, is FDA is talking about the new era of smarter food safety. There's guidance documents available for this, but one of the major pushes within this program is food safety culture. Now, this is just FDA speaking on it. It's not a regulatory requirement. But if FDA is speaking on it and talking about it everywhere, maybe in 2 or 3 years, we could see this as a regulatory requirement, especially if they're promoting it hard everywhere they can talk. So we want to be aware of the things FDA speaks. So make sure you're reviewing what's going on and consider maybe implementing some of these things into your program, even though it's not a regulatory requirement. Now, I know many of you also follow GFSI audit schemes. And if that's the case, you already have food safety culture elements within those programs. So if so, you might want to take a look at what FDA is talking about and seeing if you're meeting all of those elements that they're saying currently are best practices. One more program that's really important to make sure we're following is recently FDA published a new regulation for traceability for high-risk foods. The regulation is out there, and I would recommend that you start reviewing it. Compliance, though, we have 5 years to comply with this new regulation, but it is intense and kind of complicated. And I'm sure in the near future, we're going to see guidance documents from FDA on how to meet compliance. But again, staying up to date allows us to make sure we're going to be audit ready when those requirements are mandated to be in place. Now, audit ready every day. Many of you do third-party inspections. However, some of you may only do announced third-party inspections, which does allow you to prepare and to be ready. If you want to demonstrate that you're audit ready every day, consider committing to announced audits as well, because this makes you more prepared so that you have no idea when your audit's going to be, and so you're going to be more audit ready every day. You want to consider a process, like I mentioned, to remain up to date on regulatory requirements. You should have a documented procedure to do so. One of the best things I've seen facilities do is they have a written policy that explains the following. We receive information from FDA, and they get on FDA's email notification list. So they get all kinds of information from FDA. They say we get information from various food safety organizations like AIB or IFSQN. And then we receive information from our suppliers or our partners or maybe even other organizations. And we review this information when we have food safety meetings and either update our policies or determine if any changes are needed. And then they just have documented proof that they're following that program. This is a really good way to demonstrate and to make sure that you're not going to allow things to fall through the cracks and remain up to date. And then, as I've been stressing through this presentation, training is critical. You want to support and explain how training meets your regulatory requirements. As an example, if you're required to have a preventative controlled qualified individual, and let's say you take training from a organization, FDA may say, can you prove to us how that training meets regulatory requirements? You should be able to articulate how it does. And that way it'll help that process very quickly. And then, like I mentioned before, you may want to prepare your staff to include yourselves for interviews, because FDA may just want to determine, are you really qualified? Yeah, I can see that training certificate, but did you pay attention and do you understand really what's required? And so having these things prepared is going to make you audit ready, and it's going to create a lot less anxiety for you if you're doing these things. Now, I also provided some resources that can assist you too as well. Now, some of these I've mentioned during the presentation. As an example, if you don't already, but would like to, the first web link can allow you to sign up for email notifications from FDA. What's really good about this is you can select what notifications you receive. Like you can select things related to FSMA, or you can select things that are related to recalls, or things that are related to draft guidance documents, whatever. You don't have to pick everything. The second link is the link to the new era of smarter food safety. If you'd like to know more information so that you could review it and take a look at, the link was provided. The third link is a link that allows you to see enforcement and criminal investigations. So you can take a look at, I gave you the first poll about what do you think is the #1 reason for 483s in 2022. You can go to this website and you can see by year the various reasons facilities received 483s. In addition, you can get links to warning letters if FDA has issued a warning letter, which would be more significant than a 483. And then the last link there is actually links to how FDA does inspections. and how to prepare and what to expect from an FDA inspection. They provide that information so you can include these in your procedures and processes and be a little bit more ready and aware. These are just a few of the many resources that are out there that can assist you in making sure you're ready to go and understand what FDA is looking at. Now, in summary, hopefully, we discussed how to prepare and policies and procedures to consider. And one more thing I want to cover on that is when you develop your policies and procedures on how you're going to handle a regulatory inspection, make sure everyone that has a role is trained. But I would caution, make sure you're just not training people that may be on first shift. Because remember, if you're a 24-hour, 6-day-a-week facility, FDA could show up at, say, midnight or 1 a.m. to do an inspection. And if that happens, what is your facility going to do? Are you going to make FDA wait until the first shift team gets there? How long will that take? 10 minutes, an hour? And then how upset do you think FDA may be if they have to wait a long time before they can start? So just consider those things. And then make sure everybody is trained on what they're going to do. We also talked about training and the importance of making sure we're meeting the requirements of qualified individuals if it's applicable. We also talked about how can you make sure you know if your facility is ready by conducting really deep self-inspections and program reviews, and if gaps are noted, developing documented corrective actions and verifying that they're effective. And then we talked about some things that we can do to be audit ready every day. And if we are audit ready every day, we should really be comfortable with FDA can come anytime they want. We know we may have a few problems, but we know we're going to be really good. Now, before we do the questions and answer session, I would also like to mention that we currently have a 20% discount available on some of our top online courses. So when you scan the QR code that's on your screen right now, you're going to be directed to our website. And if you click on the banner on the main page to discover the discount details. Just as a side note, the offer ends at the end of this month, August 31st. So you might want to take advantage of this before it's too late. But other than that, that concludes the presentation, and I would really be happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Thanks very much, Earl. Great presentation as usual. Let's get to it then. There are lots of questions, as you would expect. First one from Joanna. Okay, so if I produce in the UK but export to the US, do I have FDA inspection? And if so, how? Remote inspection or in person?
So a great question. So yes, you could have an FDA inspection. If FDA is going to do an inspection at your facility, they would only focus on that equipment, that line, or just those products that you're producing for export. They would not look at the other products that you're producing for the UK. There has been cases where they've done remote inspections, but right now this has been more focused on the foreign supplier verification program requirements. So it can be on site. And like I mentioned, currently they are leveraging the use of those trained accredited third parties to help them with FDA inspections overseas. So it could be one of those types of facilities too. In most cases, they're going to notify you ahead of time because they know travel could be difficult or so. So a lot of times, some facilities overseas, they'll reach out ahead of time. Hey, we would like to visit your facility at this time, but it's not always applicable.
Okay, got you. Question from Leah. Recently, FDA has recognized third-party standards like SPF, BR, CGS for the C and Global Gap align with FDA regulations. How does this help during an FDA inspection? If we get an inspection, can we avoid this by presenting certification?
So this is a good inspection, or this is a good question, but I want to caution. FDA does recognize that GFSI audits help, like SQF or BRC, but there is a big difference between regulatory requirements and what GFSI requires. And I'll give one example: food defense. Food defense in most of the GFSI schemes requires just three things. You got to conduct a vulnerability assessment, you got to develop mitigation strategies if identified, and you got to make sure that it's part of your food safety management system. And if you're compliant with all of that, you're good to go for GFSI. But if you have to comply with regulated food defense, most of that will not allow you to meet the full requirements of regulated food defense. So if you're good with SQF, as an example, in case of regulated food defense, if that's all you did, you may not comply with regulated food defense. So there is a difference. So although it can help you, you should understand that there are differences and it may not fully prepare you. So the certificate will not be enough for FDA to say you're compliant with all regulatory requirements.
Got you. A question from Abdi: is wheat flour field needed FSMA rules?
If I understand the question correctly, agricultural type items like, say, farms that produce wheat or farms that produce vegetables for consumption, they do follow underneath a different regulatory requirement. It's called the produce safety rule. So there are special requirements for that. In most cases, I am not aware of FDA doing that type of farm inspection. However, state inspectors do, because they're looking at water quality and, depending upon the produce, testing requirements that are required in that regulation.
Okay, got you. Mustafa, what is the standard used for FDA inspection? How can one become an FDA inspector?
Oh, good question. So believe it or not, that one link I provided in there, the last one, you can also manage to get to your way to FDA's actual inspection manual. But if you want to become an FDA inspector, there are job postings on FDA that explains the duties and responsibilities and the qualifications, so that you can determine if you meet, and it'll walk you through how to apply for those types of jobs.
Okay, question from Phil. If we don't purchase from any foreign suppliers directly, we use brokers, does FDA still require to have a foreign supplier approval program?
So yes, they do, but you may not be responsible for it. So this is important for the FSBP requirement. If you're leveraging brokers, the broker may be the responsible person. When you're notifying FDA that you're bringing a product into the United States, you're required to fill out an electronic document. On that form, there's two spots. There is responsible for the foreign supplier verification program, and then responsible for importing the product. Whoever's entity is on that FSBP program, that's who FDA is going to visit and expect to have the foreign supplier verification program. If your broker is responsible, I would just encourage that you make sure they understand the requirements and they have that program in place, so you don't have any supplier interruptions.
Yeah, got you. Mustafa, PSQI must be carried out once or renewed each time.
This is a good question, because recently we have been notified by the Food Safety Preventative Controls Alliance. This is the entity that has built a lot of the individuals that take the PCQI training. They built that underneath FDA's purview. They're updating their materials. And so some people are already asking this question. There is no regulatory requirement to get renewed training as a PCQI. There is a requirement to stay up to date. So as long as you're staying up to date, you're good to go. You don't have to get retrained and recertified. But it is something maybe to consider, especially if you haven't done the role in a while, or maybe a little bit rusty, but it's not a regulatory requirement.
Got you. Question from Vasana. How do we know if we need a food defense qualified individual?
So the first part is if you're required to register with FDA, in a lot of cases, you're required to have a regulated food defense program. There are some exemptions. So as an example, if you're just a warehouse and distribution center and that's all you do, you only manage and distribute product. And two, you don't have bulk liquids, meaning huge storages of liquid in tanks, then you're exempted. If you only produce packaging material, you're exempted. If you only produce alcoholic beverages, you're exempted. And if you're a farm, you're exempted. But outside of that, most production facilities of food are required to comply with regulated food defense, which would mean you need to have an FDQI.
Okay, thanks. Well, question from Savan. Can one FDA inspection visit cover both Food Safety 117 and Food Defense 121 requirements?
So right now, yes. So FDA has told us that as they're doing inspections, they may do, excuse me, what's called an FDA food defense quick check. After they're done with the food safety audit, they may spend about 20 minutes or so and ask to see your regulated food defense plan. They may ask anywhere up to 20 questions just to verify compliance and then move on. As of this day, there has not been a documented 483 for anything food defense related. So FDA is educating as they regulate, but we do not know when they're going to start really enforcement, if that makes sense. So you still want to be prepared.
Okay. Question from Radoka. Did they change the compliance date for traceability? It was my understanding the deadline is January the 20th, 2026.
That's correct. It is 2026. So we still have a few years to comply. Sorry, I didn't mean 5 years. So thank you for calling that out. 2026 is the compliance date.
Okay. Eagle-eyed there. Question from Martin. Are there courses to be certified in food defense by the FDA?
FDA does not do any training. However, they've worked with the Food Safety Preventative Controls Alliance and developed training materials to meet the requirements of a food defense qualified individual. They have individual trainings. There are other companies out there like AIB who also has developed food defense coordinator training that focuses on the regulatory requirements. And FDA says you can take the recognized course, FSPCA, or equivalent. So you can take any training you want, you just have to be able to describe how it meets the regulatory requirements.
Right, got you. Question from Sarah. We're a non-RT bakery. What frequency of FDA visits can we expect?
So if you take a look at recall data as an example, and if you remember what I said, that allergens are the #1 reason for recalls. The baking industry is predominantly has a lot of allergens. So FDA is looking at bakeries at an increased frequency. Now, I can't tell you that that means you're going to be inspected every year. It could be every year. It could be every other year. It just depends. But bakeries are probably going to be inspected more frequently than, say, a facility that makes carbonated sodas because it doesn't support biological growth, just as an example.
Okay. Vasana's asking, can you direct me to a place where I can see a sample regulatory program?
We don't have an example, but but there are. You can easily Google search, and people are happy to share. I'm sure if you started reaching out to chat to people here, they may be willing to share your regulatory policy. We can give examples of what to consider in your policy if you want to reach out to AIB and or probably other organizations too as well.
Charity, what is the best thing to do if FDA inspectors do not present Form 842.
Yeah, there you go. So there is nothing wrong, and FDA would not take offense if you felt the need to confirm that FDA is who they say they are. So you could easily reach out to the FDA and say, hey, we have Bob Smith here who says he's here to do an FDA inspection, but he doesn't have a Form 482. So is it applicable? And they would say, oh, yeah, they're supposed to. Does that make sense? However, I know some facilities, what they do is they have a process where they would record some information, still allow the FDA inspection to occur, but verify that it was actually there during the inspection process. So there's many different ways that you can do this. There's no right or wrong answer. But with today's day and age, verifying, I would consider doing that myself.
Yeah. Question from Lisa. Has FDA actually contracted with third parties, or are they just an option that a US producer can use in order to meet FSVP requirements?
So there are accredited third parties. That link, if you go to, you can see which ones have already been trained and which ones FDA is leveraging to be able to do that.
Okay. Mohammed, there are frequent upgrades into FDA regulations. How can we follow these changes by FDA so we can implement in our area?
Really, you just need to pay attention and get those email notifications. Now, I got the email notifications, and it seems like almost every day I get something from FDA. So it's very important to choose which ones are important to your industry and not just mark everything. That way you won't get tired of seeing FDA and then you start ignoring. Really focus on those things that are important for your industry. Get the team together to review them to see if it's even applicable, and then maybe discuss how you want to implement them into your program if you think it's the best practice.
Okay, got you. Just to say, it is being recorded today, everybody, and we'll follow up with a recording and a copy of the slide deck afterwards. So, and Joshua, if you have a specific question about documentation for your maize flour, HACCP plan examples, etc., go on the IFSQM forum and talk to other members and get some advice and share documents on there. Okay, question from Glenn. Can a food importer use the exporter's third-party audit report to complete a hazard analysis for the FSVP program? Is this acceptable for the FDA?
So yes, but maybe not all the way. And what I mean by that is technically when you're doing your hazard analysis for the foreign supplier verification program, there has to be one done on the ingredient. And in this case, you can even leverage the supplier's hazard analysis for this. But then there's another risk assessment you're required to do, and that's on the actual company that's producing those products. That sometimes is overlooked. And so a third party is not going to do that risk assessment of that actual manufacturer or whatever. So that's something that you're going to have to consider.
Okay, Carol, question from Carol. What is the foreign supplier's responsibility to the FSVP of their US customer?
Good. So when you're developing a foreign supplier verification program, what you're really doing is you're verifying that that company that's importing the product to you is meeting all of the regulatory requirements. Now, but depending upon the risk of that hazard analysis, you're required to verify that they're doing the right things. And there's many ways that you can verify. You can have them do a third-party audit, you get it, review it, and if there's no gaps, write a summary to say they're in compliance. You could do your own internal audits of that facility using a qualified auditor. You could do sampling and testing. If there's a risk of, say, salmonella, you can require testing of each lot as a verification activity. And then obviously, if no salmonella has been detected, you're verifying that that product is meeting food safety requirements. So that's their responsibility, is they got to be able to demonstrate that they're meeting all the applicable regulatory requirements for the products they're sending you.
Okay, a question from Jamie. Is there recommended courses for FDQI or to become an FDQI? Can it be acquired by experience?
Yes, and I'll leverage myself as an example. Before I joined AIB International, I served in the U.S. Army as a military food inspector. The military food inspectors does all food inspection for the whole Department of Defense. We manage the food defense programs. So I have 23 years of experience of running food defense programs, doing vulnerability assessments and so forth and so on. But I also have physical proof. When you get out of the military, you have what's called a DD-214. It's a form that lists all of your training and responsibilities. So I can claim experience, but FDA is still going to want to see objective evidence that my experience meets the requirements. So I may have to provide a document to show my experience and how it meets it. Does that make sense? But experience can count. But there is, like I mentioned, recommended courses that was developed by the Food Safety Preventative Controls Alliance. But then also you can take equivalent, like AIB does the training too as well. So it's all up to you on what you want to pick. FDA does not have any requirements, just they want to make sure you're trained and you understand the regulatory requirements.
Okay, a few more. Let's try and whip through them. Claudian, does FDA enforce require expiration dates on the products?
It depends on what your expiration date is for. Is it just for quality, or is it for food safety?
Okay. Glenn, does the FDA require mandatory lot numbers to be on food product master case labels?
Yes, but it needs to meet traceability for your products. So however your lot codes are, can you trace back to that production run all the ingredients that went in it in the event that maybe something is hazardous?
Okay, got a question from Madhu. Does the FDA inspection cover out of process procedures and programs like food complaint handling?
It just depends on during an inspection. So as an example, if I'm doing something and I find a risk, I may ask to see your complaints to see if you've ever identified this before and maybe didn't do anything about it. Does that make sense? So it could be a program to look at, but if they're not seeing anything, they might not ask for anything in that program.
Okay. Sherry, can you tell me more about requirements for border crossing with FSVP?
What I can tell you is before anything comes into the United States, you have to electronically notify FDA and Border Protection Agency the commodity that's coming in. You need to include the manufacturer that it's coming from, who it's coming to, and you got to do that within a certain time frame. By ship, there's a different time. By air and by coming across the border, there's a different time frame. But all of this needs to be communicated ahead of time. And then FDA will determine if they need to do an inspection on that item or if it can go forward quickly.
Okay. Last couple here. Okay, question from Mohammed. Is it mandatory to apply Part 121 mitigation strategies to protect food against intentional adulteration, or can we use other guidelines like GFSI?
Yeah, GFSI would not meet all the requirements that's listed in the regulations. So if your company is not exempted and you are required to comply, you have to comply with all of that regulation.
Okay, and final one from Alan. During a US FDA inspection, do they ask for GFSI audit reports as a reference during the FDA audit itself?
It depends on what you have in your program. So as an example, if you'd identified a supply chain preventative control and you're leveraging a GFSI audit from your supplier as a verification activity, then they may ask for it to see, did you follow your program requirements? But they should not be asking you specifically for your GFSI audit.
Got you. Right, on that, we've got through all the questions, 5 minutes over, but really appreciate it, Earl. And lots of great feedback in the sidebar there. Great webinar. Thanks for the webinar. Excellent webinar. Great presentation. Great presentation. So superb. Thank you for this valuable information, Arvind. So cheers. Thanks very much, Earl. It's great having you on again. I know you've done a few in the past, and it's can't wait for the next one.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Right. Superb. Thanks very much, Earl. See you again. Have a nice weekend. Okay, ladies and gents, I've loaded your certificate in the sidebar. We're following up with the recording slides and the certificate, etc., in an hour or so. But for now, thanks for attending and engaging today, and we'll see you on the next one. Have a lovely weekend.